The Serengeti was quiet. An abnormal silence. Normally in this land, silence was not a sign of peace, but of impending danger. Because life here belonged only to those who survived. This was the wildest place in the world. Dark at night and deadly hot during the day. And in the midst of this deadly geography, there was a man lying motionless on the scorched earth. His name was Darian Kellan. One of the most experienced rangers the Serengeti has ever known. A quiet, determined, lonely man. A man who listens to nature, respects it, but knows all too well its cruelty. But today, things were different for Darian Kellan. Because no matter how strong he was, this was a land that never showed mercy. His body was exhausted. His lips were dry, his breathing heavy. He didn't even have the strength to move his hands. He looked up at the sky, but all he saw was a blur. His eyelids were heavy and his consciousness was in and out. It was as if he slept, he would stay there forever. But lucky or unlucky for him. At that very moment, the world around him began to move silently, faint footsteps on the ground. Silent but heavy. Like death. The approaching shadows were the only clear image that reached his tired eyes. At first he thought it was an illusion. A trick of the heat, an illusion, an image in his head. But no. It was real. The shadow grew. And then a pair of eyes locked onto it. Golden eyes. Glowing, sharp, powerful and frightening that a lion, but no. Not just a lion, that it's Raho, the cub that Darian had pulled from the dead all those years ago, the one he had rescued from the trap with his own hands when he was so small, the one with the wounded leg, the one with the blood on his fur, the one who was scared but stubbornly clinging to life. And now he stood before him like a giant. And there was something in his eyes. It was not the lion's teeth that squeezed Darian's heart, but the meaning in those eyes that he recognized him. Raho recognized him, and Raho was not alone. Behind him were 3 other lionesses. They surrounded the perimeter. Their steps were silent, their gaze alert. But strangely, none of them attacked Darian. None of them saw him as prey. It was as if Darian was part of them, fear was giving way to confusion. As Darian struggled to keep his eyes open, one thing echoed in his mind. How is this possible? Because in the Serengeti, the rules were clear. If you fall, you die. If you are weak, you perish. This was not a place for second chances, especially if you were lying motionless on the ground. But that day, nature was writing a different story. As his eyes slowly closed, his mind traveled back years to that day. The moment he rescued a tiny cub from a trap. His frightened look. His timid withdrawal when she held out her hand. And then the courage to smell Darian's hand. The first seed of trust had been planted that day. But years had passed. Raho was now a giant. The king of the Serengeti, and that king, now stood over the man who had given him life all those years ago. Darian parted his lips with the last shred of strength. His voice was almost non-existent. But the word that came from his heart mingled with the wind of the Serengeti. Raho, the Serengeti. That wild land beating in the heart of the world. Beauty on the surface, death in the depths. Eternal silence at night, scorching hell by day. Nothing here is ever what it seems. And surviving here is not just a matter of luck or strength. It takes spirit. It takes patience. It takes courage, and in the middle of this land, there was a man. His name was Darian Kellan. Everyone knew him, but almost no one knew him. Because Darian was a man who escaped from the crowds of people and took refuge in the silence of nature. He loved silence since he was a child. People's artificial voices and unnecessary conversations were not for him. The language of nature was much more meaningful to him. The howling of the wind, the high-pitched song of birds, the crunch of drying grass. Darian believed that this was where real life was hidden, and for years he had lived as a ranger in the Serengeti. In this lawless land, people said many things about him. Some said he was a legend, some said he was crazy, because what Darian Kellan did was not ordinary. He went alone into places where even humans were afraid to go. At night, when darkness fell, instead of pitching a tent, he would stand on the rocks and watch the sky. He carried only a small bag on his back, a knife, a radio, and a notebook. That notebook was the witness of his life. Every day he wrote about the animals he observed, their tracks, their behavior. But what he included most in that notebook were not people. It was animals. Because Darian believed in animals, not people. On that day, the day everything changed, he was walking on the western side of the Serengeti. The heat of the air was sharp enough to burn your skin. The sun shone mercilessly in the sky. The earth was cracked. Dust kicked up from under his shoes with every step. Darian's eyes were keen, never missing the slightest trace of the ground. That day, too, his steps were silent. He approached the areas where poachers had set traps. Wire traps were one of the Serengeti's most infamous scars. These death traps for predators shamed not only animals, but sometimes humanity as well, and at that moment, that scene, he encountered one of the most unforgettable moments of his life. A thin, staccato moan. A sound that penetrated you. Like crying, but different, more desperate. Darian immediately fell to his knees. He moved carefully in the direction of the sound. He crawled into the bushes. And that's when he saw it. It was one of the most painful sights he had ever seen. A tiny lion cub, a rusty wire wrapped around its foot, embedded in its skin, covered in blood. The cub's body was trembling. It was gasping for breath. Its torso was trapped. He couldn't get out. Its mother was a few meters away, a giant lioness, her eyes wide open, but helpless. Here was the cruel reality of the wild. Even the strong can sometimes be helpless. Darian slowly raised his hand. He looked at the lioness. "Please," he said inwardly. "Don't attack. Trust me." The lioness did not move. She didn't show her teeth. But there was something in her eyes that would have destroyed you. Desperation, that universal fear of motherhood. Darian reached for the wire trap with trembling hands. The wire was cold. It was bloody. He cut his hands. But he didn't care. He struggled for minutes. The wire wouldn't fold. The cub whimpered. The lioness looked on, and finally, the trap was released. The wire loosened. The cub pulled his foot out. But she couldn't walk. She was trembling. It collapsed to the ground. Darian thought for a moment. What do I do now? If he left it with its mother, maybe she would accept it. But what if she didn't? What if the cub runs away in fear, and for the first time in his life? Darian Kellan held a lion cub in his arms. He gently cleansed it with water. He wrapped her feet. He helped it take small steps. The cub looked up at him. There was a question in its eyes. What are you? For him, this human was not danger, but curiosity. That night Darian never left their side. He camped far away, in silence. He watched them until morning. And in the morning, the cub was a few steps closer to him. Darian named him Raho. That was the name of the survivor, and in that moment, an invisible bond was forged between them. The Serengeti recorded something that day. An unspoken friendship began between a man and a lion. Years passed. Raho grew up. He disappeared into the wild. He disappeared with his mother. But Darian always saw his tracks. In footprints, in hunting tracks, sometimes in a distant glance, and now, that little cub. Darian had come to change Kellan's life once more. In the Serengeti, a thin vapor danced over the earth as the sun rose slowly in the east. The cracked ground was silent with the exhaustion of surviving the night, even the wind was barely breathing. This was one of the Serengeti mornings Darian Kellan knew best. And yet, there was a heaviness in this morning that he could not name. The air was different. Even though the sky was blue, there was something strange about it. Something was going to happen that day. And Darian knew very well that nature was adept at sending such messages. Darian had left his camp early. He was wearing his usual plain ranger outfit, a small pack on his back, a knife at his waist, a notepad in his pocket and the old binoculars he hadn't parted with in years. He was walking alone. But this walk was not ordinary. Today, news had come that poachers had set new traps. Someone had snuck into the heart of the Serengeti, killing their way through the animals, and Darian was determined to stop it. His steps were silent, his eyes as alert as ever. The slightest trace in the undergrowth, a broken twig in the dirt, a blade of grass pressed into the ground, they all told him a story. Darian spoke the language of nature. Quiet but very clear. But, that day, there were other traces under the ground where Darian had walked. Somewhere, far away, another pair of eyes watching him. Raho, the king of the Serengeti, was no longer just a lion. He was Darian's shadow from his past. And the strange thing was, Raho couldn't forget him either. Every time Darian took a step, those days so many years ago flashed before his eyes. The moment when he had plucked a tiny puppy from death. That bloody wire, those eyes full of fear, that first contact. The silent agreement that day, but there was another detail that no one knew. Darian didn't just save Raho once, there was another night between them. And it was the wildest night on the Serengeti. That night, Darian paid another life debt. You want the Serengeti to be dangerous only during the day, don't you? No. No, 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 no. The greatest fears begin at night. Because at night, the true face of the Serengeti was revealed. Raho was a young male lion. He was getting used to hunting with his mother. But that night, a night when the rain poured down and lightning tore through the sky, changed everything. Darian, asleep in his own camp, he heard it. A muffled, deep growl, but mixed with pain. He immediately grabbed his flashlight and went outside. And he was horrified by what he saw. Raho was trapped on the riverbank. Stuck in the mud. A fresh wound on his body, a fresh trail of blood, and very close by, one of the Serengeti's most dangerous predators that night, a giant male leopard. Leopards rarely attacked lions. But if he found a young, lonely, weak lion, he wouldn't miss, and that's when Darian Kellan, in his mad bravery, had once again defied the laws of nature. That he shone his flashlight directly into the leopard's eyes. He threw rocks. Screaming, beating the ground, trying to make himself look as big and scary as possible. Normally such actions would be considered suicidal, but that night, nature once again recognized Darian. The leopard retreated. Silently disappearing into the darkness, Darian approached Raho in the mud. The young lion stared. Fear, suspicion, but also familiarity. Darian bent down. He held out his hands. "I'm here, little man," he said in a whisper. Raho looked into his eyes like a human. It was as if in that moment, he had accepted once more. He surrendered once more, and that night, out of that mud, Darian had pulled that giant lion out with his hands. That night the Serengeti recorded something else. 2 lives, knotted together, lying face down in the middle of the Serengeti. Darian Kellan's breathing grew heavier with each passing second. He drifted in and out of consciousness, everything around him disappearing into a blurry fog. The sky was too far away, the earth too real. His body burned with thirst, his muscles trembled. His eyelids resisted closing, but at some point the brain became too lazy to even feel the pain of the body. Darian had already reached that point. The last thing he remembered was falling to his knees as he untangled the wire trap around his feet. After that, it's dark as a vortex. But for Darian, the real darkness began now, because the Serengeti never forgave the fallen. To fall to the ground in the Serengeti was to feel the breath of death on your neck. Here, nature only loved the strong. If you were weak, you were just an opportunity for predators. A human lying on the ground was the most vulnerable form of nothingness. And now, the earth around Darian began to stir, sounds in the distance. Footsteps approaching. But they were not human footsteps. Light, stealthy, careful. Steps that did not echo in the silence, but touched the earth subtly. Coyotes, first a single one appeared. Then others. Preparing for the night, the hungry jackals could smell prey from far away, even in hot weather. Especially if there was a human lying motionless on the ground, it was the Serengeti's easiest meal. The jackals approached Darian cautiously. They were sniffing, looking at each other, communicating in an incomprehensible silent way, but there was something they didn't know. The rules of the Serengeti were clear, yes. But that day, those rules had changed a little, because Darian was not alone. There was silence coming from another part of the land. A heavier, bigger, deeper silence. And this silence, it was the silence of a king. Raho, the king of the Serengeti, appeared silently with his huge body. In the shadows, unnoticed by the jackals, it was not only death that surrounded Darian. It was also protection. Raho and his 3 lionesses appeared out of nowhere, upsetting all the jackals' calculations. At first the jackals did not know what to do. They took a few steps back. But hunger was such a thing that sometimes it could make them take even the most insane risks. One of them dared to take a few more steps. That's when it happened. Raho bent his huge body slightly. A bone-shaking roar came from deep in his chest, a cry of fear that shattered the night silence of the Serengeti. The jackals froze. That sound was more dangerous than the attack. Because it meant, one more step here, and you're dead. The jackals retreated. But they didn't leave. Because nature is patient. And coyotes, they know how to wait. Darian was not fully conscious. But he could feel something changing around him. The vibration of the earth, the footsteps of the lions, the approaching scent of Raho, it was real to him. She even thought she could see those golden eyes through her eyelids that were about to close. The only sentence that passed through him at that moment, maybe the strangest sentence of his life: "You are still here." Yes. Raho was still there. And there was something else. Raho was sitting right next to Darian. His giant head lowered to the ground, silently watching Darian. Beside him stood lionesses, and in the outer circle stood a giant king who kept his eyes on the jackals. But the night of the Serengeti was not limited to jackals. In the distance another voice, higher pitched, more ominous: hyenas. Hyenas were the real scavengers of the Serengeti, the real problem creators. Braver than jackals, more numerous, more persistent, and greedier. And now, they recognized this in Darian. When the silence of the night was broken on the Serengeti, a new battle in the wild began. Raho was on his feet. The lionesses were in position. The jackals stood aside and watched the hyenas arrive. And Darian, in the haze of his consciousness, he felt miraculously protected, but the danger was growing. Because the hyenas were far more numerous than the jackals. The silence of the Serengeti that night was the heaviest Darian Kellan had ever heard. Even the earth seemed to listen to his breathing. Lying on the ground, motionless, he could feel the world around him changing in his bones. His consciousness was blurred, his eyes were closed, but his body continued to perceive the vibration of nature. Because survival in nature is not just about seeing with the eyes. From the vibration of the earth, from the smell in the air, from the changing sound of the wind, he knew that death was approaching, and now that vibration was different. The coyote's footsteps slowly receded. The stealthy footsteps were replaced by heavier, more numerous, and braver ones. Hyenas, the true problem creators of the Serengeti. Their arrival would change the rules of the night. Because when hyenas gather around a prey, they never give up easily. When Dar first heard what sounded like high-pitched laughter in the distance, he managed to squint his eyes open. He could see, though blurred. First the silhouettes, then the horrible sight that became clearer. There were more than 5 of them. Then came the 7th, the 8th, and even the 10th. Like a small army, they were approaching step by step. Not only narrowing the circle, but also threatening the perimeter of Raho and the lionesses. Normally lions, especially a male lion, alone would be enough to scare the hyenas. But numbers were always the greatest weapon. Hyenas know this well. 1, 2, 3, as their numbers neared 15, their confidence grew, and so did their courage to take risks. For Darian, it was the strangest scene of his life. For in his vague gaze, he was watching the rarest sight a man can experience in the wild. A huge male lion, right next to his body, never taking his eyes off the hyenas for a moment. Lionesses, lined up shoulder to shoulder. Silently communicating with each other, these perfect predators, formed a wall of flesh. The hyena's eyes shone. Darian saw in their eyes not just hunger, but something else. Not courage, madness. Wild hunger sometimes drove creatures mad. And that night, that madness was growing. Raho stepped forward. He stepped forward with his giant body. As he walked on the earth, each step shook the ground. His head tilted slightly to the side. His ears pricked up. His gaze was not on the jackals, but directly on the leader of the hyenas, the leader. A hyena, a little bigger than the others, with a torn ear and the scar of an old wound on his face. As they locked eyes, Serengeti held her breath for a moment. Time stopped for Darian. This was the true face of the Serengeti, the silence. Tension. And then, Raho roared, a sound that penetrated to the very marrow of Darian's tired body. The deep sound from his chest tore through the darkness of the night and spread across the Serengeti. Birds flew from their nests. The jackals retreated even further. But the hyenas, after a moment's hesitation, they began to narrow the circle again. For the first time in his life, Darian saw not just the strength of a lion, but its spirit. Raho wasn't just surviving in this life. He was protecting. He was possessing. He was protecting Darian not just as an old acquaintance, but as one of his pride. And this, unheard of in the Serengeti, the hyenas took another step that a lioness leapt up. Suddenly, she charged. She knocked a hyena down, but she didn't kill it. She was just drawing a line. She was saying, "This is it." But that boundary was about to be broken, because sometimes nature doesn't recognize any rules, and there was something Darian didn't know. That night, the hyenas were not alone. From far away came a much thicker, much more menacing sound. Another male hyena, one of their leaders, had appeared on the scene with a huge body. This was not a good sign. Because male hyenas rarely get involved in an attack. If he was interfering, it meant the battle was on. Raho saw it, and Darian, perhaps for the first time in his life, he saw real anger in a lion's eyes. And at that moment, Raho moved step by step, slowly, slowly, but with deadly determination. The lionesses lined up behind him. The jackals had already scattered. And then the real battle of the night began. Was growing before Darian's eyes. A phrase echoed in Darian's mind. Perhaps a sentence he had never said, but heard in his heart. "I saved you once, Raho. Now, you save me." But the threat was not over, because at that moment, another sound came from far away, the sound of an engine. A lifeless, metallic, man-made sound. Mason Dre and Lena Voss, the search and rescue team, had finally tracked down Darian, but the sight they would see would be the most unforgettable sight of their lives. Mason Dre's heart had never beaten so fast. Only a hoarse sentence escaped Lena Voss's lips. This can't be real." When they both first saw the view from the top of the jeep, miles away through binoculars, they couldn't speak for a few seconds. Because they would have believed whatever they saw, but this? They were not ready for this. In the middle of the bare, scorched earth of the Serengeti, lying motionless on the ground is Darian Kellan. And around him, arranged like a half-moon, lions, but the lions weren't just standing. They weren't protecting. Raho, a giant of a man, was at the base of Darian's head. Mason squinted through his binoculars. This. Yes. It had to be him. The famous male lion. Raho. The one Darian told the story about years ago, that Darian had rescued from the wire trap. The king, then a cub, now a legend of the Serengeti, but now it was about something else. The hyenas. Lena bit her lip. Mason. It's surrounded. There are so many hyenas. Mason's eyes flickered back and forth, one moment to Darian, the next to the hyenas. The circle had already narrowed. The lions had set up a great defensive line, but the numbers were terrifying. hyenas were the most dangerous creatures in the night hunt because they attacked not only with hunger, but with madness. They don't retreat. They were patient. They approached step by step. And now, Mason saw very clearly. If they didn't do something, this conflict would explode. Raho rose slowly from his seat. He threw his torso forward. His giant footsteps pierced the ancient silence of the Serengeti as he walked over the ground. A few hyenas came a little closer. And at that moment, Raho roared a second time. That it was such a roar. Even the windows of the jeep shook. Mason was startled. Lena froze in place. The sound. It echoed like an ancient, wild, primordial sound from the depths of the Serengeti. The jackals had already disappeared. The hyenas took a step back. But this was not a sound that would dissuade them. It was a call to battle. Darian, at that moment, he vaguely opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was a giant shadow covering him. Raho. It was as if he was checking on him one last time. Is he breathing? Is he alive? Is he here? He wasn't leaving until he was sure. Mason's decision became clear. Get ready, Lena. We're going down. If Darian is alive, we have to get him out of there. But we'll be quick and quiet. Otherwise the hyenas or the lions, both of them might perceive us as a threat. Lena took a deep breath. She slapped her hands on her knees. Come on. They turned off the jeep engine. Silently they opened the doors. Even as their feet touched the dry earth, they felt as if their hearts were pounding. Step by step they moved forward. Their eyes were always on Raho. The lionesses were watching for threatening movements. The hyenas were circling even further, and then the moment came that a hyena, leaving all its fear, all its nervousness behind, charged forward. The target was clear. Darian Kellan, but then, nature is sometimes written in seconds. Raho leapt like a bolt of lightning. That it was as if the sky had come down. A cloud of dust covered the ground. The hyena spun in the air. Raho's paw slammed into the hyena's chest like a deadly slap, and the lionesses attacked. The battle was on. Mason and Lena watched, frozen in time. This was the truth of the Serengeti: death on one side, loyalty on one side, the struggle for survival, and in the middle, a man lying on the ground. Darian Kellan. Mason looked at Lena. Now, Lena. Now or never. The two quickly crouched down. The battle of lions and hyenas was a few meters away, but their target was clear. Darian. Mason looked up into Darian's face as he reached his side. Come on, man, no dying here. We're here. And for maybe the first time in his life. A tiny, weak smile appeared on Darian Kellan's lips, but the story didn't end there, because Raho turned one last time. Mason and Raho locked eyes. In that look, there was no brutality, just familiarity, just respect, just. You can pick her up today. Because I waited here. And that was the truest story the Serengeti has ever written. And that night, nature forgave man once more. That night, the Serengeti witnessed a story it would never witness again. The hyena herd was in disarray after that unforgettable lesson. The determination in Raho's eyes showed the true power of winning a battle without taking a single life. Even as the hyena leader disappeared into the night, never to be approached again, Mason and Lena managed to carry Darian to the jeep. But not one of them could find the words to truly explain what had happened that night in the Serengeti. Because that story belonged in another book written by nature. When Mason looked back at Darian for the last time, Darian's eyes were open, though squinted. But his gaze was not inside the jeep, it was elsewhere. He was looking at Raho, silently disappearing in the distance with heavy steps. At that moment even Mason understood. Some bonds could not be explained, some stories could not be written. They could only be lived. Lena parted her lips, almost whispering, "Why do you think he didn't leave? Why did he protect her all along?" Mason took a long time to answer. Because the same question was echoing in his mind. In the end, the only sentence that came out of the silence was, debt. But nature's own debt. That night, as the Serengeti fell silent once more, that scene was forever etched in Mason's and Lena's minds. As the jeep pulled away, a single tear fell from Darian's eyes. It was not a tear of pain or fear, it was a tear of gratitude. To nature, to the past and perhaps to fate itself. Days later, when Darian Kellan came back to life, everyone who came to visit him asked the famous question. Why did the lions protect you, Darian? But Darian just smiled. He said the same answer over and over again. Sometimes life gives you back when you least expect it, where you least expect it. It is the silent justice of nature. Raho was never heard from. Mason and Lena tracked for months, sometimes finding footprints, sometimes hearing distant roars at night. But whenever they were walking in the Serengeti and Darian thought he was alone, he looked back with a strange feeling. And you know what? Sometimes he swore he could see those golden eyes looking back at him from afar. Now I ask you, how would you feel, if a wild lion that you saved years ago saved your life one day? What would you say to him? What would you look into his eyes and do? Do you think true loyalty only exists between people? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's grow this story together. I would be incredibly happy to see your opinion first in the comments. Because sometimes what completes a story is not the heart of the writer but the heart of the listener. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to leave a like. If you want more of such powerful and emotional stories inspired by real events, subscribing would be the biggest motivation for me, and I know, if you made it this far, you are a true story lover and a viewer with a heart. I'm glad you're here. Subscribe, like, comment. Because in the next story, maybe I will start with your comment. Serengeti does not forget. Raho will not forget. Darian won't forget, and I think you will never forget this story.